Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, it's the end of Memorial Day weekend. I hope everybody had a great break, those of you in the U.S. and I guess UK. For me, I managed to get in 3 podcasts, one at home, one in Brooklyn, and one in Lower Manhattan, a long run, another hike plus a run, and a drive to Newark to pick up some chairs my wife had ordered. I also started reading A Gentleman in Moscow, which I'm enjoying the heck out of. So by my lights, that's a good holiday. But time's sort of the essence here, so let's dive right into this week's show. My guest is the great illustrator and designer and teacher and more, Stephen Guarnaccia. I first came across Stephen a few years ago at an event at the Society of Illustrators. I mean, I came across him in person. I'd seen his work over the years. But at that Society event, which we talk about in this episode, he was the one guy who outdressed me. Since then, I've seen him at a few other events and festivals. I have preemptively upped my game to try to keep up. But it's kind of nice when there's somebody with some sartorial splendor in the illustration world. So when I interviewed the wonderful artist Nora Krug last year for her graphic memoir, Belonging, during the research for that, I discovered that she's married to Stephen. So I pitched him on the podcast after my episode with Nora aired. And then I bumped into Nora, Stephen, and their daughter at Toronto Comic Arts Festival 2 or 3 weeks ago and mentioned again that I'd love to record with Stephen sometime. Nora mentioned that he had an exhibition coming up, so we should get together sometime soon. I'm putting in quotes. I put that in quotes because the exhibition, in fact, opens tonight, and it's running through June 23rd. If you're not listening in real time, shame on you. You should be dying to get an episode the moment it comes out, but I understand. That means Tuesday, May 28th, 2019. Stephen's show is called Fatherland, and it is a collection of painted 3D objects that we talk about during the episode. And it's a little bit tough to explain, so we'll get to it over the course of the conversation. It will be at the UE Gallery, YUI, on Eldridge Street until June 23rd. Again, 2019 for you time travelers. So we got together this Saturday morning with the idea of getting this episode out in time to get New York area people to go see Fatherland. There's an opening reception on May 28th, which is today. You ought to attend. I'm hoping to be there unless the weather is absolutely horrific and I can't get in from New Jersey. All of that said, we don't exactly get around to talking about Fatherland for a while, but trust me, we do eventually. It's just Stephen's had this amazing and varied career, and he has so much to say about illustration, design, story, his own evolution through this process, and we veered all over the darn place. We didn't even get to a bunch of the key topics I thought we'd discuss, like mid-century culture, things that he's written and designed books for. So I'm hoping we'll get to do a follow-up sometime so we can kind of tackle everything else. For now, you get a conversation with a key figure in the U.S. illustration world and one who's thought a great deal about personal and professional artistic needs and responsibilities. And it's all couched around this idea of Fatherland, this solo project of his that's an exhibition that has traveled throughout Europe and is now making its New York debut. So I'm glad we got to just dive into this conversation without too much time to prep, but I'm looking forward to a lot more. So, as caveats go, the fridge turned on a few times. We were recording in their kitchen. Ambient noise levels, therefore, change a little bit. It gets a little bit of background noise. Also, his toddler was upstairs, gabbing a little. No big deal. He thumped the table a few times. I was gonna make a comment, but figured, I don't want to make anybody self-conscious while we're recording. Here's a bio for Stephen, which will explain a lot of the wild and varied career that I mentioned. Stephen Guarnaccia is associate professor at Parsons School of Design. He is a former art director of the New York Times op-ed page, and his illustrations have appeared internationally in books and magazines, on greeting cards for the Museum of Modern Art, watches for Swatch, and his murals for Disney Cruise Lines. His books introducing children to modern architecture and design include Cinderella, a fashionable tale, The Three Little Pigs, an architectural tale, and Goldilocks and the Three Bears, a tale moderne, all published by Abrams. Stephen has authored or co-authored numerous books on popular culture, including Black and White, A Stiff Drink and a Close Shave, and Hi-Fis and Highballs, all published by Chronicle. And he is a co-author with Stephen Heller of School Days and Designing for Children. He has had solo shows in New York, Milan, and Toronto, and his installation, Fatherland, has traveled to Bologna, Barcelona, London, Berlin, and Tabor, Czech Republic, before coming to New York City. His drawings for the exhibition Achille Castiglione, Design, at the Museum of Modern Art were published as a book by Corraini Editore. He has received numerous honors from AIGA, the New York Art Directors Club, the Society of Publication Designers, and other professional organizations, and was a Hallmark Fellow to the Aspen Design Conference. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Stephen Guarnaccia, already in progress with some anecdotes about how he attended the Good Omens premiere in New York City the night before.
Who, first of all, see Nick Offerman in full monk's garb and David Tennant, who I found out took his name from Neil Tennant of Pet Shop Boys.
No shit.
His name is David MacDonald.
I just assumed
he's Scottish, and
yeah.
He had a really Scottish name, but there was another David MacDonald. And he, as a kid, was listening to the Pet Shop Boys, and he liked it. Anyway, so he was their nicest, because I'm a huge fan of his from his mainstream stuff like Broadchurch, and I went up to him very shyly and said, I wasn't even going to come up to you because it seemed so corny. He said, no, do, and he was. Anyway, all the guys were there.
I think Gaiman was posting pictures from it, or somebody was. Gaiman was in a black turtleneck and black leather jacket or something.
Well, there's a lot of joking about Gaiman's turtleneck.
Yeah.
His daughter in particular was joking about it. But it was kind of great to see, and this is the first time I guess he's been a showrunner on the show, and just to see but all of these people are we're all transforming ourselves. We're all trying to kind of, partly because of the changes in the industry, changes in our own career, what our own goals are, but so that Neil Gaiman goes from, writing comics to writing novels to show running, a major Amazon series, to Seth constructing.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, the Seth thing,
it's a different story.
Yeah. I mean, he's taking art. Well, he asked a question that, and I have a weird analog for it. Seth talked about whether, if he had the money, would he just make his art for himself and not publish anything? And it was on the flight home from Toronto that I remembered, and this is going to be the corny part, this amazing interview with Billy Joel, who...
that you did?
No. The biggest name musician I've recorded with is Moby, who's going through his own craziness right now with his new memoir coming out. Billy Joel mentioned or talked about how he has not recorded music since the disasters. Well, he put out an album in '93 that the label just didn't do anything good with, River of Dreams. And he just gave up after that. He said, you know what? I've got enough money. I'll go play live. I will have my residency at Madison Square Garden. I will entertain people. I'm going to make classical music at home. And I'm not going to record a thing. I'm just going to make whatever music I want to make. And he'd said, he's pals with Paul McCartney, and he says to Paul, why are you putting out albums? What are you chasing? What do you need in terms of recognition, audience?
Certainly can't be the money.
Yeah. He says, why do this? Why put yourself through hearing critics say you're washed up or this? Screw it. Again, his thing was, I'm Billy Joel. They fly me by helicopter from the Hamptons to Madison Square Garden so I can play. What do I owe the record label? I owe the fans. And I make music, I play the old hits for them, and it's fine. And it hit me that Seth and Billy Joel may have something in common, which I may be the first person ever to draw that connection.
and Seth probably would love to have his name dropped in the same sentence.
It's like, what a weird, But I have to send that to him because it's a really neat interview, but does capture, as disparate as those artists are, after enough decades of publishing of whatever form you're in and the audience interaction, what's really important to you.
But now let me just ask you: was Seth's answer? Yes, I would make it.
He thinks he would.
But the thing that now I love Dominion as a city, and I loved the
little documentary.
The documentary, which to me, and I don't know if Seth sees it this way, but because he kind of shapes visually, packages everything he does, including packaging other people's stuff. The fact that Dominion came in such a beautiful package, that the documentary was so kind of, it looked like it was shot like a Seth comic. I know that he made the city, or at least the way I understood it from reading about it, was that he made the city so that he could completely understand the place that he was making the comic about. And then the buildings at a certain point, it sounds like, started to take on a life of their own.
Yeah.
But
he also...
I guess I imagine that those things were made with some idea that eventually they'd be reproduced multiply in the public eye and not just, say, like in an art gallery.
Well, the city itself tours. It had a little tour where he took it around, but he mentions he's got like 1,000 pages of writing and illustration about Dominion. He didn't know what form it was early on, but now it's become articles about the city, like the history of the mayors. He starts writing and creating this history and drawing these people.
Well, and his catalogs of personalities, his visual catalogs of personalities, it would fit perfectly.
Yeah, but his take is, do I need to publish that? He said some of that will end up in the collected Seth, the Seth Artist edition that D&Q is going to do in a couple of years. But at the same time...
So here's my other question about this, because all of us have drawers filled with those projects that we actually intended to publish. And for whatever reason, we either never finished them, we had contracts for them, and we simply,
things changed.
We went on to other things, or that we've tried to publish, nobody's been interested. And so we keep also making work, in a sense, for ourselves, with the hope at some point that and I'm not saying this is everybody, there may be many more Billy Joels in the illustration and comics world than either you or I know about, but where we make these things really for ourselves, hope that they get published, but we don't stop making those things for ourselves, whether somebody publishes them or not. I've got a number of projects which are as much to me kind of an art project in the sense that they purely satisfied my own needs for what constitutes a complete project that answered the various concerns that I've got anytime I make something. I'm not going to call it art, but make something visual.
Art's good.
The show that is about to open Monday night, which was stuff that was purely made out of an inner need to make it, these three-dimensional objects. Halfway through, I became aware that they were pieces in a three-dimensional installation that was a visual narrative. A visual narrative that had a very different structure than the kind that I might initiate as something, that's to go first to a publisher. But so at a certain point, I made a decision that none of these pieces actually will ever. The work isn't for sale. partly because I don't want any of the works to be separated from each other, because it'd be like selling, and I know that certainly in the mainstream comics world, people sell, I guess even in the alternative comics world, they sell pages, they sell panels, but that's what it would be like for me. It would be like taking a page from a picture book and detaching it from the whole. So after a certain point, I actually started shopping around this body of three-dimensional painted objects, which answered no needs other than my own internal ones. I think that, and I don't know what Paul McCartney's answer was, but mine is, it's what we do. This is what, I'm an illustrator. It took me a while to realize that I was born an illustrator. I went to, I didn't go to art school. I went to Brown University, partly because I sort of looked at the list of schools that had relationships with art schools. Well, RISD.
Right there.
I can't remember what some of the other ones were, but I ended up actually not applying to too many places because I fortunately got into Brown early decision and dropped out, by the way, early as well. I dropped out after 2.5 years.
As you should. Early admission.
Yeah, you got to keep it all on the early bird side of things. And I worked so hard to try to think of myself as an artist, because the classes I took at RISD were drawing classes. They didn't have a really robust, at the time, illustration program. This was the 70s, the mid-70s.
Did you overlap with the Talking Heads?
No.
Well, you wouldn't have known who.
No, because I had a good friend who was a couple years older than me. She was from high school. She was the sister of a very close friend, and I think she knew David Byrne. But they were just, I think, as soon as we all graduated, she said, I knew David Byrne.
Yeah, of course.
So I think I knew, but like a year later, that he had been there. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, lack of illustration classes you were saying?
Well, not a lack of them, but it wasn't, the school was very much focused on developing, at least the way I understood it, developing you as an artist, and then you could specialize in certain disciplines. Okay?
Yeah.
But especially the classes that I was taking, like a basic drawing class, I felt like I needed to draw like an artist. Mm-hmm. And even though all of my models from the time I was a little kid were, I'll call them commercial, but were people who were making work for publication, for mass dissemination. Mm-hmm. My earliest, I once did a little timeline, my earliest professional fantasies were, I want to work for Walt Disney. That's when I was in my Disney phase of watching stuff. Then I wanted to work for Marvel Comics. I discovered Thor in I was 8 years old. I was born in 1953, so like in 1961. Thor was my be-all and end-all. My brother and I sort of cut our teeth in comics on Batman and Superman. Batman was my favorite character. Superman was my brother's. And if you knew me and my brother, you'd see that that's the perfect. And I think that probably, you either like John or Paul. You either like the Beatles or the Stones. You either like Batman or Superman. The world is just conveniently divided up into these, black and white. But then when I discovered, and I was kind of the misfit in my family anyway, when I discovered the misfit comics, mainstream comics company, Marvel, that had all of these angsty characters, I left DC behind. So then I wanted to work for Marvel. Then Mad Magazine. So I want to work for Mad. Then my parents always had the New Yorker, but it was always kind of just a little over my head. My mother showed me Charles Addams cartoons, and we'd drive through suburban Connecticut, and she'd go, "Oh, there's a Charles Addams house," because there were still a lot of Victorian houses around. I didn't really know what that meant, but and this was before, I don't know what the year of the Addams Family cartoon was.
And were you Addams Family or the Monsters?
Addams Family or the Monsters, yeah.
You got to be Addams Family, because...
Well, but it was also, I tended to always go with what I considered the original. So I might have, had I come into the more Gaiman kind of sphere, I didn't really read them in their time. I probably would have been a Moore.
Yeah, because he was there first. And
right. And the more authentic kind of vision.
Yeah.
But there was, this is a digression, and there's probably going to be a lot
This
of
whole thing is about digressions, don't worry.
But I've often thought about, do you know My World and Welcome to It?
I know the name.
William Wyndham, I think, was the actor.
Yeah.
It was a Thurber
That's where,
sitcom.
Yeah.
Around the same time as an Addams Family sitcom. There was a time where being a cartoonist was
There was cultural
big enough
cachet
to make you the star of, the character, the leading character in a sitcom. But I used to tell my students at Parsons, I had two sort of periods at Parsons, 80 to 90 when I taught as an adjunct, my 3-hour-a-week class, and since I've been there now as a full time, but about 16 years. Once upon a time, illustrators were among the highest paid people in America. It was also a time, frankly, the 80s and 90s, when illustration was a very, very viable career where you didn't actually have to have thousands of others. You had side things going if you just needed more outlets for but you didn't need them to cobble together a career.
Your living. Yeah.
Now the hybrid career, and I think it's very exciting. And this is what we tell parents too: is you should expect your kids to not only be who would want to only be an editorial illustrator and have people feed you somebody else's text. You want to do that, but you also want to exercise this muscle, writing and illustrating. You want to throw a little motion, on the fire. And there used to be also, I remember I interviewed Al Jaffe and Mort Walker before they wanted to get, and this was just the last 5 years, I think, last 10 years, before, Jaffe's still with us.
I know.
That's another digression, the longevity of illustrators and cartoonists. I want to be, Seymour Quast at 85, still cranking out kids' books and graphic
he was
novels.
amazing. When I sat down with him, I'm like, you're just... The thing with Quast, and you may need to keep this in mind, at least from my brief exposure to him, he does not look back. It's an incredible body of work.
I have two real touchstones in illustration that I've carried with me really since the beginning. One is GBU, who I met maybe my second visit to the New York Times in 1977. And we're still friends. We were in a faculty meeting at Parsons the other day. Mm-hmm. And Seymour, who we've only become friends in recent years. But the kind of cerebral, conceptual, very European BU, who, the kind of epitome of quiet, almost abstract, in his kind of detailed, and he's become more and more realistic, but even in his realism, really kind of his thinking is obviously abstract. But even visually, he's a minimalist. And then Seymour, the eclectic, drawing from every tradition. He's not unaware of the European tradition, but he's, and comics, I always identified with, I remember going to the Society of Illustrators when I first got to New York, and the annual shows. I didn't see anything that looked like me. Mm-hmm. It was all dappled putting green paintings. It was the time of English and the Connecticut school, and big, and paint, and gold frames, and I was a Steinberg guy. Steinberg was really, and probably still is, the kind of the gold standard for me. And I was very excited a couple of years later going back to the Society and for the first time seeing Keyes work there, because I suddenly thought, maybe there's a change going on. Mm-hmm. But so the thing that I identified, especially with Pushpin and certain illustrators when I was growing up, was that their references, and it's what I liked in fine art as well, their references were all pop cultural. So I think the thing that tied together all the pushpin guys was they grew up on and showed it in their work, newspaper comics, the golden age of newspaper comics. They grew up they were born in the late 20s, early 30s. In high school, really the only fine art that I really liked, I grew up in, my parents were, we lived in Fairfield, Connecticut. We went into my grandparents, were in Long Island. My grandfather was a jeweler, my mom's German Jewish, my dad's Italian American. My mom's father was a jeweler, just off 47th Street. We'd go into the city all the time, go to the museums. So I got a grounding in museum art, and some of the history of it. We had I still have it over in that pile, a little miniature booklet of Piero della Francesca, this horrifying mural with people's heads being cut off and stuff. But I would go look at that. It was in the little bookshelf next to the TV set. So I had these reference points that were from the history of fine art. But the first fine art that really was like, bing, were the pop artists. Yeah. The fact that they were drawing on popular culture, that they were not seeing their antecedents necessarily in the long history of European art, but that they were looking at package design and comics, and simultaneously pushpin came along. It was pretty much the same, the 60s.
Right. Can you talk a little about that intersection of illustration and design for you? Mm-hmm. Again, you talk about coming up, realizing I guess it gets back to the earlier statement of realizing you're an illustrator.
Yes.
And then what that means.
But the other thing is,
to wind back through all those divagations. So in my bio, I call myself an illustrator and a designer. Mm-hmm.
But I have the same vague discomfort referring to myself as a designer as I might referring to myself as an artist. Because I came into design through my love for vernacular design, hand lettering in particular. I always saw letter forms as drawings and as having character. I loved the way that Steinberg animated letter forms, gave them thought processes, an E with a thought balloon. And also the care with which he would either calligraph or construct a kind of I found out that his father, I think, was produced boxes, had a box factory, and printed, had all these typographic forms that Steinberg played with. And when he saw these blocks of these wooden type blocks, he understood both actually, but also internally that that letter forms are objects. And I remember going, go to the library. I loved going to our, local public library, go look for a book and then look to the left or the right of that book and discover something that I wouldn't have been looking for, but then became my favorite next author. And they had a couple of great Victorian packaging books. And I loved those letter forms. And I started just drawing these Victorian sign painting letter forms, especially the letter forms that had dimension. And that always was part of my the drawings that I made for myself. I have a drawing upstairs from high school of me, every artist draws their hand drawing with all the things that are on my desktop. And there's a little bottle of art tone ink that Seymour, and I didn't know at the time anything about Seymour or Pushpin, but that Seymour had designed the label for. And it was this beautiful, very kind of cartoony, but very Victorian at the same time, which to me really sums up a lot of their early work. So I already loved letter forms and thought of them as much as characters as any cartoon character I would draw. So I was always drawing them. And at a certain point in my career as an illustrator, I was only doing, I was a pure editorial illustrator. I tried every now and then to get some advertising work. Occasionally I got some, but it really wasn't who I was. I thought there was nothing more fun and no higher calling than to get, especially when they were really interesting and smart, a piece of text and respond to it with drawing. And so that was really for the first few years of my career. That's all I did. I probably spent the first 2 years just making spot drawings. Probably spent the first 2 years just making black and white spot drawings, because there was a time when the front of and the back of the magazine were all print. There were two different passes through the press, and it was cheaper to print the black and white stuff, and you could charge. You could pay your illustrators less if they were making black and white. And so I was a black and white spot guy. I remember the first. I don't remember the first color image, but I remember the anxiety of getting a color assignment and realizing I'd spent all my life drawing in black and white and an outline, and I didn't know what to do. Yeah. And I asked a few different people. I might have even asked Guy. I settled on watercolor just because I wanted to make color illustrations that looked like old Disney cells. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know how they did that, and how they got those muted tones. And I realized that you fill black and white with a wash, and it retains the line.
How much of illustration is reverse engineering for you? How much was the learning illustration, that process of, I like this, I need to figure out how to make this, as opposed to someone just teaching you?
Almost all of it, because, so as I say, I went to Brown.
No YouTube videos back then.
I'm not that kind of learner in any case. Everybody tells me I should go look up whatever that woman's name is. It's not a woman, but the site is, the platform is, all those tutorials.
Oh, yeah. I forget the name. Linda or Lisa or something.
Yeah. Right. Anyway, I just don't learn that way. Mm-hmm. It's not until I have to do something, and I tend to be somebody who says yes, even if I don't know how. And that's really been, I had never done a book yet. I did not come out of school with a portfolio. In any case, most of my classes were at Brown, and I took Russian literature and creative writing and linguistics. Just took whatever I felt like taking. And I took bookbinding at RISD, and I took drawing at RISD. And after 2.5 years, I was just tired of it. Mm-hmm. It just wasn't fun. And a friend of mine had gone off to Italy for a year, and we had stayed in touch, the sister of this woman who knew David Byrne at RISD. And what she did during that year, I wanted to do. It sounded great. So the following year, I went to Perugia in Italy and learned Italian. Then I went to Urbino, which is a smaller town, for a couple of months and took a course in letterpress printing. And then with the idea at Brown at that time, they encouraged you to take a leave of absence. That was could be part of your own curriculum in a way. Yeah. And then come back and you would apply whatever you'd learned out in the world to your education.
It was the 70s. So.
It was the 70s. Well, it was also one of the reasons I chose Brown was because it was you could do it entirely pass-fail
curriculum,
school course. And yet, with all of that leeway, I just still felt like, man, they cut me loose and they want me to go back in the barn. So that was 2.5 years. I went around looking for, some kind of job. I wanted to get out of my parents' house, which is where I'd gone back to live. I went with my mom to, I just basically shadowed my mom on her errands, just what else am I going to do? She was driving around. She was going, but my parents were school teachers. They were planning a trip during the summer. I struck up a conversation with one of the travel agents while my mom was booking the trip. He said, "So what are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I don't know. What do you want to do?" "I want to be an illustrator." I said, "Oh, my husband's an illustrator. He needs help. He needs an assistant." I went and met this guy in the town I grew up in. He, a guy named Bert Dodson, terrific guy. He now lives up in Vermont, but he did kids' textbooks mostly. And he also was one of the reviewers for Famous Art Schools, which were just over in Westport. Mm-hmm. And I worked with him for about a year. That was really my education. He had me doing storyboards for film strips.
Oh, I remember.
And then you turn the...
I have no idea what kids have nowadays. I assume everything is a PowerPoint or something.
Yeah, everything's...
For us, beep, and you turn.
So he did kind of a little bit of everything, and I got a great education there, and he also continued to give me more, he trusted me more and more. I did research for him. I filled in color, so I kind of started to learn some, like how to handle brushes and things. Mm-hmm. But he also, and I realize I'm not exactly answering your question.
Oh, it's okay.
But he was good friends with Randy Enos. Do you know Randy?
You were connected on Instagram or something like that. So yeah.
And so Randy, this was the days of Chicken Guts, National Lampoon. I loved his kind of ratty line and his offbeat sense of humor. He said, I know Randy Enos. If you want, I can introduce you. Took me over to Randy. I showed Randy my portfolio was 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper I'd drawn on while I was in Italy for this year. Yeah, I kind of elided a couple of things.
Yeah.
In any case, I went off to Italy. I worked for this guy, stopped working with him, went off to Italy because I hadn't figured out what to do. So maybe I worked for Bert just for the summer, then had to have some plan, went to Italy, stayed in touch with Bert while I was in Italy because we wrote letters back and forth, and then he hired me back when I came back. Anyway, when I was kind of at the end of my experience with Bert, he introduced me to Randy. My portfolio was literally things I had cut. If I doodled something I really liked on the corner of a piece of paper, I would cut it out. I couldn't draw. I had a sketchbook that had
one page.
Exactly one page drawn in because I could not, I wasn't comfortable enough to
you didn't want to
show who I was to mess the sketchbook up.
I get you.
Yeah. What I did do was I cut things out and I stuck it. My sketchbook was a scrapbook of little bits and pieces of drawings that I felt,
were good, but you could always pull them out if you needed to. Yeah.
Well, and they could also lead to other things. Mm-hmm. Showed that to Randy. Randy was incredibly generous. I still, when we bump into each other in society, we still hark back to that moment where he opened up his address book and he said, well, you should go see Ruth Ansell at the New York Times Magazine, Steve Heller at the op-ed page. He's also at the book review. You should go see this person and this person and this person. And he basically opened up all of New York editorial illustration to me. But I went into that world of illustration, and fortunately I met Steve and Mike Valenti the first day. Mike Valenti was the deputy under Ruth Ansell at the Times Magazine, still living at my parents', showed them my portfolio, went back home, was at my high school library waiting for my mom to be done teaching. My father drives up and says, Steve, somebody just called from the New York Times. He was all out of breath. It was, I ended up when I was art directing at the Times at the op-ed page, I kind of sat between Heller and Valenti, and we still can't remember which one of them called me first.
We'll say Heller.
But basically it was within the same day that I think they both called me the same day, but Heller's was due the next day because it was a letters piece, and Michael's was due, in a few days. And that really was my start.
See, Bill Griffith told the story during TCAF when we recorded that Heller also bought his first piece.
But, that's an interesting story. You should find out who got the first job from Steve Heller. It would be a documentary in and of itself.
Because Bill said it was when Heller was at Screw, and that he bought the piece because Griffith happened to draw the right size. literally Bill had measured out like what, this usual page, spot is and put it together. And Heller bought it because he didn't have to do any cropping or cutting. He just bought the first comic strip because it fit. So he was.
Well, Heller is a great example. Also, a guy without a degree who basically learned everything on the job.
Yeah.
Met Brad Holland through the Underground Press. And before Brad was, the Society of Illustrator Gold Medal winner. So it's really the legacy of people who got their first break with Heller.
Yeah. That actually could be a pretty neat subject to tackle.
Have you interviewed Heller?
Yeah, we did one.
I mean, there's a kabillion facets to his career. You could devote.
He was one that we did an hour and a half, and it was like we should do another 4 hours. But I was literally in New York for a conference, a 3-day business trip, and I was like, well, my first meeting isn't until 11 a.m., so I'm going to set this up so I can go down and record with him at 9 at SVA and then head back up. It is SVA, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's always weird to me, juggling the Gil as podcast guy and Gil as business guy. But I'm a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical industry. Right. There's a convoluted story around that.
So this is your
passion, love, whatever. I pretend it's art, but I know it's
no.
Yeah, it's good, but it's not what you guys devote your work and lives to.
Yeah, but it helps.
It
helps us understand who we are and what we do, and it helps a public audience understand it.
Sure. Honestly, moving into the illustrator side of things, it began maybe 2 years ago when Fantagraphics connected me with Cuneo.
Oh, you mean from comics?
Yeah. I've been comics, prose writers, a couple of musicians, but no one who was purely illustration. And Cuneo leads me to Chardello, leads me to Blit, and once you have those three other people, let's get together, and that turns into Blackman, Quast,
Arnie Roth.
We have talked about it. He had some ups and downs.
And I don't know how he is now.
Yeah, his wife and I have corresponded a little.
Because he was before Cuneo, he was the guy you wanted to go here at the Society of Illustrators.
Yeah, I've always heard he was electric.
The opening remarks.
But yeah, just meeting the illustration side and seeing how the business has changed, as you were talking about in terms of the 80s being a sort of go-go era and what you have to do when the go-go era dries up. And seeing how, particularly those first three, Cuneo, Chardello, Blit, how each of them is working in their own direction. Right. They have commonalities, but each is figuring out his thing.
Well, and I would say my favorite commonality about all of them is the pen line. Anyway, to just kind of get back to this, learning on the job kind of thing. So I had a non-portfolio portfolio. Mm-hmm. Got the first job from these guys. I took out a rubber stamp and I sort of made a rubber stamp and I made part of a drawing for Heller's thing. I did the first thing I did for Michael Valenti. Also, I had a piece of metal type. So this kind of relates a little bit to my design interests, and I use that as a base. In fact, the day that piece came out in the Times, I get a phone call from the Society of Circles United, or whatever it said on these, or Triangles United. I guess it was a triangle, whatever it said on this piece of type. And they were shocked that I would use and it was an organization that supported what they used to call wayward girls, but young women who, and how could I use this as part of their illustration? They were about to sue the Times. So that was my entree into the world of illustration. This was like the second illustration that I'd ever published. But I met Guy shortly thereafter at the Times, and he said, "Oh, you're Stephen Guarnaccia. You are the man who is always experimenting." I said, "Guy, I'm not experimenting. I don't know
what I'm doing."
I had a different style for each thing. I said, "I have no idea what to do." Mm-hmm. So I came into illustration, certainly having drawn all my life, since I could remember, but not really having any idea what makes a professional illustration. I, at a certain point, having done enough of this, filling little, I think of it as spackling, plugging holes in a magazine page, and it really, with spots, the piece runs this length. We've got this much space to fill. Let's slap an illustration in. I thought, I would really love to do book jackets because the epitome for me of image making is combining words and images together into an image. This was before I started realizing that I also wanted to write text that went along with images. But this idea of combining letter forms or words with images, the old poster artists, especially the guys like Cappiello and the Beggarstaff brothers, and these people where the poster, every aspect of it was made by the same hand. And I thought, I want to do book jackets, but I've never done a book jacket. So I made a bunch of fake book jackets, and I brought them around, and I finally started to get book jackets. And this is every time... Is that...
No worries.
Every time I've wanted to do something or when somebody's asked me to do something, rather than say, I don't know how to do it, I've just...
When do you need it?
Well, and
that gives you a little time at least to figure out how to do it.
I really haven't done research. I've thrown myself into it, figuring that I'll figure out a way to do it my way. Mm-hmm. And that was true when I'd never art directed. I'd never used a computer actually for anything other than email when I got the job at the op-ed page. They were kind enough. I mean, I'd worked with the Times for so long and knew Tom Bodkin, the executive, the executive design director of the Times, and I dropped out of Brown at about the same time. We were both in the same class. We just have known each other. Steve was still working there. I got the job to art direct, and they brought in somebody who gave me a crash course in simply how to handle artwork that came in digitally and put it on a page. Right before that job, Steve had started I had stopped teaching at Parsons. I'd done a little teaching stints at RISD, and where you do this kind of grueling commute.
It's from New Jersey, about 3+ hours.
Well, you go up and you teach your class, and then they used to have a little kind of apartment that they would put you up in. But a lot of people I know who do that just come back the same day. But it was exciting. It was fun to be back in Providence. But in any case, there was a little hiatus of teaching there. And Steve was just starting the MFA design program at SVA, and he asked me if I would teach. And I said, I'm not a designer. And he said, I know, but I like the way you think, and we need somebody who can do that. So I taught design thinking, but I had no experience doing that. So over and over, yes, in terms of the sort of retrofitting. I'm represented by Reactor up in Toronto, very kind of inactively, but there was a time when I had CIA in London and a rep on the West Coast and Toronto, and I always rep myself in New York. I love going in and meeting a client and sitting down and figuring, and it used to be that you would go in and meet a client, you'd show your work, you'd talk about the job, you'd hand deliver the job back. When I art directed at the op-ed page, the only people who delivered their artwork personally were Arnold Roth and Ivan Chermayeff. They would come in with these big things, and it was great to see, analog art.
A ding in an email box. And So you became a designer by Heller's definition of being a designer.
Yeah. Well, and worse than that, I taught designers, people who went on to become real designers.
Again, did you realize in that moment that you were a designer and didn't understand what that meant? Or is it something where what you do translates?
I've expanded my definition of designer. Mm-hmm. Seymour Quast, if you ask him what he does for a living, he's a designer. He's a designer even when he makes an illustration. He treats all of his illustrations as design solutions. Yeah. They're about color and composition. I think the idea for him probably just comes naturally, and so he doesn't actually think that he's probably not stretching any muscles when he's doing that, because it just comes so easily to him, the concept side of things. I think of him as a conceptual illustrator, but I often think also that his concepts are, kind of color distortion, just even the idea of introducing a letter form into an image is a conceptual decision.
For you, what got easier over time? You mentioned with Seymour that, again, certain things just become almost reflex.
Yeah, I think, but my assumption with Seymour is that it always was. Yeah. The thing for me that has always been natural, not necessarily easy, is drawing. And it's something that I've always done as a refuge. It's something I do as a nervous tic. Hallie used to hate it when I would come into his office because I would draw all over his blotter. I keep sketchbooks that I just fill, maybe one a month, one every 2 months, because I have big files of things I call idle art. They're doodles, essentially. They're, the stuff I draw when I'm on the phone. And that has always informed my work. I often go back to especially the unconscious stuff. If I'm stuck, not for an idea, but if I want to come up with a new way of articulating something, or if I'm tired of the kinds of faces I'm drawing, because I know that the unconscious stuff often taps into stuff that I'm not even necessarily comfortable with. It doesn't mean that drawing is easy for me, because I always have to then apply that when I'm doing it in a context of either a personally assigned or a professional project. I have to, you have to perform, it's just like all of the rehearsing. And when you get to that moment, ideally, what will come out, in the instrument you're playing, or in the part that you're reciting, or, in the drawing tool you've chosen, and the way you've decided to compose it, and the characters you've decided to populate your image. So I always feel like I can make... I now mostly do my own projects and teach. So my own projects are kids' books that I initiate, some that I do on commission, and things like these three-dimensional objects that I've been painting.
Which we should get back to,
yeah.
It being sort of the reason we were getting together initially. But yeah.
And that relates to the design thing as well, and to the aside about Reactor that I just want to get back to in a moment. But I feel like I've drawn enough that when I was especially active as an editorial illustrator, that my goal was, and I felt fairly confident, that I would never do anything less than a professional job. I wouldn't do crap. And that occasionally it would rise to some other level in my mind that would satisfy me beyond that. And that was because of all of the, years and years and hours of just continually, I can't not draw. I just draw all the time. So that's the easy thing. In terms of Reactor, the other sort of retrofitting was, one of the great things about Reactor was that they had a gallery space and they gave their artists shows. And I wanted to do more than just show illustrations that had already been printed. First of all, my work tends to be quite small, doesn't really hold a wall very well. I used to draw same size, often even smaller, and blow it up. I had always understood that if you drew for the New Yorker, you must draw that size. How else do you get your images into print? I didn't realize, that you could actually shrink things down. So from a young age, I really learned to draw, and it felt most natural from the wrist down. I was couldn't be an action painter, the elbow had nothing to do with it. Yeah. So I didn't want to only have a show of things that had already been in print, where print seemed to me the natural medium for those things anyway. And I'd learned that both from Steinberg and from Glaser. Glaser felt that the original didn't really mean anything, especially at the point where they were working with Celotac and things that were, Celotac was the clear color sheets that you would rub down that had a very short shelf life. I mean, that stuff destroyed itself immediately. Steinberg used to say that it was he made books. Really, he didn't make drawings.
And Katcher said this also, that his work is printing instructions.
Oh, that's interesting. That's a nice phrase.
There is an aside I've done on the show a bunch of times. Ben, when I first did a live show with him years ago, no one will be interested in my originals. like 80 people at the new school. No, actually, I think we'd all want to see that. Oh, no. Basically, those are just printing instructions. And we're like, yeah, no, we'd really like to see what your originals look like for that reason. But,
well, Steinberg said that he was like, he thought of his work as like a poet who, it's not the manuscript that you read.
Yeah,
you read the printed book.
Sure.
And so for him, it was the collection of his work in the printed form that was the work of art. So I always really held on to that. But at this point where I had this opportunity to fill quite a big space at Reactor in Toronto, I started to think, what could I do? And I wanted to make objects. But I have always been a 2D guy. I'm not a 3D person at all. But there were certain three-dimensional forms that I really loved that I wanted to apply paint to. And it began with lobster buoys that I just thought were incredibly sculptural. I love the idea that every lobsterman painted them with their own livery and that the shapes were all hand-carved. This was before they were styrofoam. I started collecting lobster buoys and painting them. So this began my process of finding objects that were forms that were evocative of something to me and painting them. And I usually painted them in some figurative way. That brings us up to, and it sort of combines my interest in design and letter forms with this desire to make objects. I was on sabbatical from Parsons a few years ago, and I wasn't really sure. I thought I was probably going to devote myself to making a kid's book, because that's what I do. But more and more, I'm a big flea marketeer and a collector, and I kept being drawn to these objects that I didn't understand my attraction to them. They weren't the kinds of objects I was drawn to in the past. And they were really kind of simple tools, saws, but then pipes, and all of these objects that were kind of quintessential man-made forms that seemed to have some emotional tug. I realized started to form a constellation around my feelings about and my relationship or lack of relationship with my father. Mm-hmm. There were all these kind of masculine objects that I associated with him, and I kept finding more and more of them. And then I thought, oh, you know what I need? I need a shoe shine box. I need so I took these forms, but in this case I wasn't really interested in. I would take a lobster buoy and I would paint the whole thing and then I'd paint a face on it. Here I more and more left the object pretty raw, respected the form and even the kind of wear on the object. The
weathering that it had undergone.
And I would just add a word to it. Mm-hmm. And I would bring out my inner sign painter and start using some of these Victorian faces. I don't know if you've seen any of the posts I've been putting on Facebook lately or Instagram, but some of the objects. Yeah. And I'm a big fan of puns and wordplay. I love Duchamp and his appropriating everyday objects, and also his love for the bad pun. And one of the pieces actually in the show that's called Fatherland is Dada. It's just a little sign for DADA. And I realized that some of the objects I'm making owe a lot to, Man Ray's objects and Duchamp's objects. But, so there's a shoe shine box, and on the side of it I painted Shiner. Now, my father was not an enormously abusive guy, but the relationship that we're in was a really difficult one, and he often expressed himself physically. I'm aware also that coding some of these words like Shiner, he never gave me a shiner. No. But I love the idea that this box is a shiner, and that I guess I always felt that there was the potential for me to be on the wrong end of my father's anger, in a physical way. So it's not a chronicle about, I'm not coming to any conclusions in this show. It's not a portrait of him, except in he was a person who I totally don't understand, and as close as I could get to him is in sort of arraying around sort of his absence. He died a number of years ago. These objects that I associate with him and these words that sort of evoke something of the complicated and difficult relationship that we've had.
How do they feel about you as you started to get success as an artist? You mentioned your mom supporting you, introducing you and all that. But
my father was the kind of guy who would say in high school when I'd be up at like midnight painting, and I did actually, I found an old chest of drawers that I painted with an image from an old orange crate. So even then I was... Though I didn't connect it to anything I was going to do in the future, but it was sort of the beginning of those, those letter forms on wooden found objects. He came down. He said, "What are you doing? Why aren't you in bed?" I said, "Well, he said, I hope you can support yourself in the style to which you're accustomed." He really, he was not happy understandably, about my dropping out of college. I was a good student. My brother was an exceptional student. He had the highest grade point average in the history of actually our high school.
Nice.
I got the occasional D. I really wasn't that interested in school. Taking an extended leave of absence that continued to this day from university attests to that. He didn't really get that. My mother would have preferred I stayed in school, but she really, really valued. She herself, I think, had wanted to be a writer. She was an occasional painter, and she did tons of crafts projects. She loved the fact that I was drawn to art and that was going to be my career. My father did. The only time I've ever heard him brag about me was when I started to get stuff in the New York Times.
I was going to say, the way he raced up to tell you that either Heller or Valenti had called, the Times still has that cachet, and it always did with that, son of the New York Times. Yeah.
Also, the amazing thing, Milton Glaser had come out with Milton Glaser Graphic Design when I was in college, and I worked at the college bookstore, had a great discount there, and I bought it. And my parents asked me what I wanted to do, and I gave them that book because in it, there's a photograph of a cocktail he designed, maybe for the Russian tea room. There was a toy store he designed. There were toys he designed. There were book jackets. There were illustrations. He just, whatever he wanted to apply this, gargantuan kind of creative imagination and ability, between he and Seymour, Milton is the fluent master draftsman. What I love about Seymour is that I've always imagined that he maximized what he couldn't do, and that's what made these utterly engaging, his strange color combinations. There's another story, I think, in the Lennon and McCartney, that Quast and Glaser, these creative partnerships that are greater than the sum, obviously. But so the great thing about the Times, though, and working regularly for the Times, my parents needed me to show them the Milton Glaser graphic design book to explain what being an illustrator was and why that could be a lucrative career. When people asked me what I did, initially, because I know that a lot of students struggle with this with their parents, what is being especially these days, but what is being an illustrator? What is that all about? I remember one friend of my parents, when I told them I was doing work for the op-ed page, said, "Oh, I love that page. That's the when I was art directing. I love that page. That's the page I always go to first. They sometimes have drawings on it, right? Yeah, 365 days a year. So a lot of the world, for a lot of the world, illustration's invisible.
Yeah,
even actually for my editor at the op-ed page occasionally. But I don't want to tell those tales out of school.
No, well, those can be off mic.
But in general. There isn't anything better than working for the New York Times if you have to explain a difficult to explain career path. I do drawings for the New York Times.
Cool.
There's almost nobody who hasn't at least heard of the New York Times, so they don't feel like, oh, you poor guy. Unfortunately, most people think that you're making way much more money. Yeah. Because the New York Times, traditionally has been on the bottom of the pay scale for illustrators.
The line I'd heard occasionally was that the dollar amount has not changed in 30 to 35 years.
Well, that was actually true. It had kind of reverted when I was there. It was really kind of sad, but you obviously do it for other reasons, and not just the exposure. I mean, it's sort of playing tennis against the best person on the other side of the net, which is some of the great thinkers, writers. Your audience is going to be an audience that's going to want to engage with what, they're not going to ignore it, assuming that they see it at all. Right. So that was always kind of interesting. And yeah, I mean, my mom couldn't have been happier. And the other thing that's weird is I'd always sort of taught off and on, but my family, my brother's a professor at Rutgers. My parents were school teachers. There's a long line of academics in my family. And I'd only sort of barely touched it, but the fact that I suddenly became, the director of an illustration program without a degree, and that was it. That like only became an issue afterwards.
Have you always felt like you're getting away with something?
But that's so, in line with never having had experience with each new thing that I tried to do. Had I ever run an illustration program? No.
Don't get me wrong. I'm a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical sector. I have no pharma background, no scientific experience, no regulatory, legislative, or government affairs training whatsoever. And yet...
Well, it's partly... So you're driven by passion, therefore, or and you don't tend to have some of the...
there aren't technical things that would
but you learn those. But you're not encumbered by the conventional ways of thinking necessarily.
Yeah, there are degrees to which, as long as you care about the thing, if it doesn't involve something that's, like brain surgery, something like that, you can, if you care enough, you can make it happen, I guess. But you mentioned with Seymour and Milton, collaboration versus working solo for you. Is there a...
Well, I spent my whole career as a collaborator. No illustrator works solo, obviously. I mean, you're collaborating with a text, you're collaborating with an art director, you're collaborating with an institution, with a publication, with, it's all collaborative. And a lot of those collaborations are internalized. They're not necessarily explicit.
How did that impact you when you start making your own art? Again,
it was great training. I mean, I had... and I knew what I wanted my work to be about when it was only me. I knew all the stuff that, sort of a mini version of that was when I said, I'm tired of just doing spots. I want to do book jackets. Well, that's all I could imagine at that point was an area of commercial illustration that I hadn't been doing yet. I wasn't thinking about, what would I do if I had no restrictions or no brief from outside.
I'm sort of wondering how you do the self-starting.
But, I over the years, I became more and more aware so I began in 77. It's, 42 years. I tend to be reflective. I tend to look back. I tend to try to make sense of what I'm doing while I'm doing it, after I've done it, what I want to do in the future. And so I was aware that there were things that I loved, like letter forms, that there was a proscription against. In fact, the early days of American illustration, when it was an import from the UK, a guy named Edward Booth Cliburn brought it over. And one of the rules was they would not judge into the annual any images that had words in them, because an illustration had to stand on its own without words or text.
Yeah.
Now, at a certain point, words and text became graphic elements, became visual elements. They also brought in content, but that became even people like Sue Coe, her work had all kinds of words and letter forms that had meaning, but also that had visual impact. And so they rescinded that rule. But in general, if I wanted to pursue this love of making handmade letter forms, I had to find other ways to do it on my own time. And I did actually make some early 3D illustrations where I started to get them photographed, where I would cut paper and combine that with little dollhouse furniture and things. But these things that were sort of bubbling under the surface really needed to come out. And so I realized, this is what I would do if I didn't have any, the next time I have a lull or I take a vacation or And I've always found traveling has been a great opportunity to sort of push myself into an area that I haven't been in before. So I've always thought about, what do I want to do that I'm not doing now? Either, and what work do I want to make for myself, or what do I want to bring to my professional work that's not always in it?
Mm-hmm. Now, the Fatherland exhibition, it's exhibited elsewhere before, right?
So it began as part of an exhibition program at the Bologna Kids Book Fair.
Yeah.
And there's this wonderful organization. They're actually arriving tomorrow because we are doing programming for the New York Rights Fair that's coming up this coming week. That's a collaboration between the Bologna Book Fair and Publishers Weekly, and now Book Expo. We've been friends. I go to the Bologna Book Fair regularly, and they have a great little exhibition space, and every year they have an exhibition during the fair. And so I proposed this idea of these objects that I'd been working on. And it was a wonderful experience to work with them, to fill that space, to think of this work as a body of work. It had text as part of it. I've been printing. In fact, the assistant coming in is going to be printing a little. There's 2 zines. One's a visual zine from my sketchbook, and one is this little booklet that's going to be texts relating to the objects. And it then got invited to LCAF, the East London Comic Arts Festival that Nobrow puts together. And from there, it went to Barcelona, and then it went to Berlin. Henning Wagenbreit, who's a wonderful illustrator and has a little gallery space called the Ministry of Illustration, Ministerium für Illustration. It went there. Then really one of the most remarkable alternative publishing festivals I've ever been to in Tábor, Czech Republic, near Prague. I had been seeing for years at the Bologna Book Fair this publisher called called Baobab. And they do gorgeous, really out there illustrated books for kids. I mean, just the most experimental, avant-garde, beautifully produced. And it turns out that Baobab is run by a husband and wife with 8 kids. That when I met,
so they can test the books on them,
and the kids also all grow up into the business. And they run this festival in Tábor where they live called Tabuk, and it's an international festival of small publishers in this charming town. And if you ever have a chance to go to it, it's great. And so they invited the show to go there. So it's been going around various places in Europe for a number of years. And finally, I just needed to get this stuff home. I just hadn't seen it in a long time. And I started looking for a site for it here. And actually, one of our alumni, Chowie Shi, had opened a gallery on Eldridge Street. And she and some other alumni from Parsons who are heavily involved in the risograph printing world, and they have a Rizzo press underneath the gallery called Lucky Rizzo, agreed to have the show, and we printed a zine at their press. And so it's very exciting to have it kind of come home to roost. And my brother, who hasn't seen the show, will be able to see it. And my mom, unfortunately, won't see it, but it's very different seeing something in your hometown or in your own environment. It's great to see it out in the world.
Yeah, but getting off your own subway. And
Well, and also that I think culturally, I expect that it will speak differently to people than it has in all these other places. I don't know how exactly, but...
Yeah, what sort of responses did you get to it?
Well, the first show was... I mean, it's been very nice, but the first show was great. It's the first time it had been seen, but also tons of publishers were there because it was the Bologna Book Fair, and a number of publishers I work with. And one publisher came up to me, teary, and said, I'd like to publish this. And more than one publisher suggested that it should be a book. I wasn't ready to think about it as a book yet, and I also felt like if it was a book, it probably should be a book in English. I mean, it was about, one was French, one was Italian, but the people felt that emotionally it connected with people, which I wasn't sure at all. I didn't care, actually. It's not that I didn't care, but
no, but
I wasn't making it.
Do it for them.
Yeah. This was something I really made purely for the pleasure of making it, and because the emotional resonances were purely internal. And I hoped that the forms would be interesting, and that as objects they'd be interesting. I didn't know if anybody would sort of get any of the stuff that to me was deeply buried within the objects, which was the kind of emotional impetus for it. But apparently it did.
Yeah, you'll find out that a lot of people have problematic relationships with their dads, and
that's the
find
other
ways
thing.
of
I did think, it'd be a great Father's Day book. And actually, Martin Collier, who's a great art director, wrote a nice piece for Verum, which is the Association of Illustrators in London publication. That also, he felt the as a son, the resonance as well. So I've been very pleased that it seems to have also connected with people as not just as interesting objects in themselves.
Yeah. Have you added or subtracted pieces from it over the years?
In particular, the way they've been installed has changed. In Tabor, in the Czech Republic, they were in an old medieval water tower, and so it was a series of very small rooms, and you had to climb a wooden ladder. And because most of the objects are wood or steel, and a lot of it is rusted or worn, it was a great environment for it. So in Barcelona, it was in a series of vitrines, so quite flat. In Henning's space in Berlin, it was one real box of a space, and that was really interesting because it meant I was using the full height of the walls. In Bologna at Hamlet, the very first iteration, it was 1, 2, 3 kind of rambling rooms with a garden in the back that was almost like an abandoned house. So that's what's really changed it. And because of space limitations, also not just how the things were hung, pieces have been added in and added out. I had thought of putting some new pieces in that I've been doing, little self-portraits of me, just my midriff that shows a shirt, a pair of pants, and a belt, about various stages in my childhood, what I and what I wore. But I felt like this show is Fatherland. From the moment I finished Fatherland a few years ago, I'd already started thinking about Childproof, which is focusing more on my childhood. Obviously plays a part in Fatherland, but it's really about all emanating from my father. This would be looking at my childhood. I'm planning on making some wooden kids books and really getting into my own passions, comics, and so I'm going to save some of those things for the next iteration.
Was there any weird Freudian or any other sort of aspect behind working on something called Fatherland at the same time that your wife was doing a visual memoir of Germany?
Fatherland, I started before she started doing Belonging.
Okay, that's what I was sort of wondering.
But I was aware of the double meaning in any case, just because Nora's German. And
was she aware? And did it which also ties into my two-artist family question. How well does a two-artist family work? I figure it's better for illustrators than it is for writers, because writers will end up invariably writing about each other and the state of the marriage. But we love each other's work, but we also have kind of different concerns in our work. I just don't have any kind of documentary bone in my body. It's just not part of who I am or what I do. Despite the fact that this Fatherland seems like it's more impressionistic rather than documentary.
It's not really a memoir.
Yeah.
And in fact, the couple of publishers here I've talked to about it, they want more memoir. They want more, and they want me to figure it out.
When you brought it up as a book, that was my thought. I'm like, I'm not sure. Just as a picture book or a book of photos by itself, it sounds good. But if you have to start stitching it together,
not just that, they wanted me to learn something in the process, and I haven't. I mean, he's still as opaque to me as he was in life. I've just been able to kind of talk to him in a different way.
Yeah.
I think that probably Nora and I laughed about the fact that it was Fatherland. I really didn't want it to have, though my mom's family is German Jewish, but I didn't really want it to have any resonance with, the Fatherland at all. And then, Nora's project really just bubbled up from a need that she had to tell a story too. So, neither of these projects were invented by us. They were, I invent a lot of things. I come up with something that I need to do because I want to do it. This, I just had to do it. And I think for her, belonging was the same thing. It was a project she couldn't not do. There were just needs that needed to be addressed internally.
And the two artist household thing works out. It works out in terms of we both have crazy work habits, but we also have to figure out who's raising the kid.
I mean, it's tricky to have, but every illustrator has a multiple career. Ours is, we've got two full-time jobs as well as being parents and partners. We've got full-time positions at Parsons. We've got our creative careers that are really enabled by these full-time positions at Parsons, so we're very grateful to Parsons for that. I have a 30-year-old son, but there was nothing more than I want to do than have a child with Nora. So we've got a child who, I do think that you can probably be a very absent parent and be a stay-at-home artist, but one of, I think, the advantages is that we're both home a lot, even if we're in our heads or in our studios for our daughter or for each other. One of our goals always is to make this work for us as a family as well as for our creative needs.
Would you push her into illustration and art, which is a long around way of asking? Yeah. What do you think of? What do you tell kids today? Going in.
I wouldn't push her away from it. I do. It's interesting because my son was a budding cartoonist at some point, but he grew up into a family where his mom is a graphic designer, and he really wanted to get as far away from the visual arts at a certain point as he could. But there's a point at which as soon as a kid starts picking up tools that make marks, kids draw. Yeah. And every kid, people say, oh, is she really artistic? Well, she seems to be, she loves to express herself with mark making. Every kid does. And we encourage that all the time. We're always finding materials for her and helping her come up with ways of making things. And I'd be extremely happy if she made things the rest of her life. Whether she did that professionally or not is going to be a decision she'll have to make. But the thing that I find too bad is that culturally, and I think in particular American culture, it's a culture of specialization, of being good at something, and I've talked to psychologists about this, that, up until a certain age, all kids draw, and then this thing kicks in where you stop doing those things that you're not good at or that aren't valued by your peers. And when those things start to be athletics or academics, or it's often not in the greater culture, creative things, partly because then it's harder to assign an eventual salary value to it. So I hope that if she keeps drawing and making things through her childhood, that she won't necessarily feel like she has to stop doing that, no matter whatever else she goes on to do.
Sort of the last question, because I know your assistant's showing up soon. Being the well-dressed guy at illustrator events, because as you know, I whenever I show up to these things, even though I'm not actually an artist of any kind, I dress nicely. And it was how I first noticed you at a Drew Friedman event, the old Jewish comedians
at the
gallery
thing at
show.
the Friars Club?
No, this is the Society of Illustrators.
Oh, okay, because there was a Friars Club thing.
As there should be, because it's old Jewish comedians and Drew. But being the well-dressed guy was
Ben Vigoda.
Abe Vigoda.
Abe Vigoda was there,
who actually lived in my town in northern New Jersey for years. When I was a little kid, we would see him at the local supermarket. And at that event...
Did you know who he was?
Oh, yeah, because Fish. Well, for me, it was Fish. I hadn't seen Godfather when I was a single-digit kid. But at Drew's event, where the place blew up when Abe Vigoda walked in, Abe's daughter was there, and I introduced myself and said I grew up and I still live in Ringwood, New Jersey. And she's like, oh, my God. I used to hate it when I was a kid, and we'd be in the Grand Union, and everybody would recognize Dad. Now I realize they all loved him. But as a kid, she was resentful that you know her dad's attention's being taken away, everybody's looking at us. And, it was a weird thing. But it is the only party I've ever been to where, oh my God, Abe Vigoda's here happened, and the entire place blew up. But again, being well dressed, working at that sort of thing, is that I've
always liked clothes, and I've always seen them as much an expression of personality and creative sensibility as the colors I choose in a drawing, and I could never figure out when there was, especially an artist or an illustrator, whose clothes didn't seem as interesting as their artwork.
Yeah. Kills me. I see these guys, and it's all just black and T-shirts. I'm like, you're working color. You should.
And I could probably pull out from my bookshelf a photograph from the '60s of the Pushpin guys, and there is Milton with this great zigzag tie. And I thought, And in high school, my favorite artist, fine artist. Not incidentally, because there's a real connection, I think, between his work and Steinberg's, is Paul Klee. And Paul Klee was a line maker, and even his abstract stuff has kind of figuration, and he used watercolor, and he was an artist that I could really see as a model, not only because of the work he made, but because the photographs I saw of him, he was always wearing a suit when he painted. And I thought, yes, that's what I want to do. I don't want to have paint-stained jeans. I don't want to have to wear if I can wear a suit. And I think it's probably one of the reasons why I also chose not to paint in like acrylics or something.
Yeah,
watercolor is so much more manageable. But I did go through a period where I only wore black and white. Another period where I only wore. Now in high school. Junior high school, I asked my parents if I could paint my bedroom 2 walls black and 2 walls white. So I already was like a kind of an interior designer, and I got a cow rug for the floor and a black and white checked bedspread. I was really conscious of environment. By high school, I felt much less divided, and so I painted everything gray. But at around that time, I'd always paid attention to clothes. I was always drawing pictures of shoes. I started to have a clearer sense of that what you put on and who you were inside were connected. And I found in the back of my father's closet, his old pleated pants, his old wide neckties. I started to wear them to high school. We had no dress code. I think we probably would have been sent home if we had like big holes in our jeans or something. But I can tell you, I was the only high school kid wearing a tie to school. And when I came to New York and started illustrating, I remember I had a one-bedroom apartment on West 20th Street, and I had a futon in the living room, that was my bedroom, and I had a little room, that was my studio. And in order not to just crawl out of bed and go start drawing in my pajamas, I started to put a tie on to go into the next room. And then that's when I realized, oh, you know what? Like, ties are the only place that men get to have fun with their clothing. I started to collect a brand of tie that my father wore and my brother wore and I wore. Rooster brand ties. They were printed cotton. They were square at the bottom, and they had really interesting conceptual prints on them, like want ads and really. I've got probably more than 100 of them now. I started wearing them, and I wrote a little piece for really early on GQ, just a little blurb at the front of the magazine about this collection. And the company still existed, and they got in touch with me. They'd been bought and sold and bought again. And they didn't have an archive. You find out early on that places do not have archives of their stuff. Stuff gets thrown out. Illustrations got thrown out by the ton, originals. And they wanted to know if they could come and photograph them for their archives. And then they invited me to design some. So I designed a collection of ties. And I don't know, I still tended, I'd have these, either my ties would be really splashy, or occasionally I'd wear like a big red and white striped jacket, but I still was fairly, I wanted to dress in a way that would please me, and I understood that also might draw stares out in the world, but so be it. But then when I met Nora, Nora just applauded. She said, "Yeah, go with it." So I just started, putting as much color and as much pattern into my wardrobe as I put into my artwork, and it's just been a hoot ever since. And now, because I love to go shopping for objects and things, I go shopping for old, odd.
Yeah. Things. It's great with color, but I'm awful with patterns still, so I still play it relatively. But there is. I've gotten really into patchwork and loud in a way that I have to try to figure out how to mitigate or
and not because there is a whole tradition of. There's even a company called Loudmouth Golf Pants.
Well, I bought the jacket.
But that's a beautiful jacket.
I bought that at TCAF. Oh. I went to Harry Rosen. I saw that. It's a maker who I have a bunch of suits and jackets.
And it's got a little lapel pin, right?
Yeah,
as part of it.
That was just that comes with it. You can always.
But that's kind of a
those.
European thing. It's very nice.
Yeah, it's Italian. Luigi Bianchi Mantova. I saw that
from Mantova.
The company, I forget where they're based, but the name is Luigi Bianchi Mantova.
Oh, okay.
But I saw that. I thought, with the exchange rate especially, I'm like, a go to hell jacket. That's sort of the color. Apparently, it's paprika color. They said, but I just figured that sort of bright rust. I'm going to walk around TCAF surrounded by people who are, again, in black T-shirts, schlubbing around, and right. I will,
Well, and you know what? Each profession has different dress codes. Comics people are a little schlubbier than illustrators, who are a little schlubbier than designers, who are,
Well, that was my real last question. Do you and Chip Kidd consult before a major event to make sure you're not going to wear the same thing?
No, but I'm a real admirer of the chances he takes.
Yeah.
And the other thing I've found, as soon as you buy something and start to wear it, once you've broken that internal barrier, can I wear this out in the world? Yeah. And you realize either that people aren't laughing behind their hands and pointing, but even sometimes saying, "Hey, great," it just empowers you. You're gonna. This is just
this is a killer. Since I got
but what I'm saying is,
I feel no shame. I have no issue whatsoever walking around, or if I take the subway over to.
But this is just the entry.
I've got a bunch. I have various usually, but I am more muted generally. This is the first brighter color. Although my one that I'm holding off on, I picked it up last year at clearance from Paul Stewart, is a very light beige, almost just off-white suit. And I'm like, wow, it's after Memorial Day. That's my thing. I'm like, I've got the bio conference in Philadelphia in 2 weeks. Do I dare show up in an almost white suit? And I figure again, I can offset that with a nice tie at all this. Within my industry, they know I'm the guy who will. But that's the other thing. I can dress like that and carry it off.
You're simply meeting their expectations.
Yeah. So I have to see if I could pull that one together. If I really just get emotionally up for it, I think, especially because I'll be traveling, so there is no backup set of clothes. There's no, let me just go back to the hotel and change into something. It is, committing for 6 or 8 hours walking around in that. And Well, I'll send pictures
yes,
if I do.
do.
There's a whole bunch more questions, but I figure you and I have to sit down and talk again sometime if you're up for it.
And if you have any follow-up, by email, I'm happy to reply.
Oh, yeah, we'll talk. But I'm looking forward to going to the exhibition. It's only a few weeks.
It's on from Monday, May 28th, until June 23rd.
Okay.
So it's almost a month.
Yeah. I'll go. We'll see Fatherland. I hope to make it to the opening reception. And,
that'd be great.
Stephen, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Joe. It's been a pleasure.
And that was Stephen Guarnaccia. His website is stephenguarnaccia.com, which means now is the time I have to spell his name. It is STEVENGuarnaccia.com. He's pretty active on Facebook, and he's also on Instagram as sguarnaccia, all one word. You should definitely check out his books, both the stuff for children and the mid-century and guy culture and school-related ones that he's written and co-written and designed. And if you're in the New York City area, please try to catch the exhibition for Fatherland at the Yui Gallery on 131 Eldred Street. Yui is Y-U-I. The exhibition is running from May 28th to June 23rd, 2019, with an opening reception on May 28th, which I'm hoping to attend. I've seen pictures of the Fatherland pieces, but I'm dying to see them in the exhibition itself. And after we wrapped, I asked Stephen, so, who you been reading? And if you want to hear his answer to that, and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The first quarter 2019 episode features book recommendations and some extra conversation with Jerome Charan, Peter Cooper, Edmund White, Eva Hagberg-Fisher, Mort Gerberg, James Osland, Joe Chardello, James Sturm, Martin Hagland, Bram Presser, and Nathan Englander. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, a patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, which one of this weekend's guests really guilted me on, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this over the weekend at Stephen's home in Brooklyn. I found street parking, so it was just the George Washington Bridge toll to get there, like $12, along with the Triborough toll to get home. I don't know how much that is, but I'll see it on my Easy Pass bill. But I also recorded next week's show on the same trip, so there was a $6 subway ride to and from Lower Manhattan in there, too. So what I'm saying is, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show and my time is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Buzz Sawyer, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Now, our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018, where you can find links to his art, his cartooning, and his music, which is at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week, kicking off Pride Month with a conversation with Hugh Ryan, author of the wonderful new history book, When Brooklyn Was Queer. Now, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.